Good afternoon. We're excited to introduce Dr. Alex Mason as our first RDAR Center Seminar Speaker of Fall 2019. Dr. Mason is the Chair of Clinical Research and Senior Director of the Child and Family Translational Research Center at Boys Town. It's a bit of a mouthful. That's why I need the paper. He received his PhD in Interdisciplinary Social Psychology from the University of Nevada, Reno, and has held research faculty positions at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, and University of Washington. Dr. Mason is a prevention scientist with interests in developmental etiology, as well as family and school-based prevention of adolescent substance misuse and co-occurring problems. He conducts work in implementation science and seeks ways to bridge the science-to-practice gap for public health benefit. He is currently an investigator on a number of federally funded grants and collaborates with researchers at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, including me, on intervention and substance use research. Please welcome Dr. Mason.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. That's a very nice introduction. In fact, could I get that for my LinkedIn? I don't know where that came from, but that sounds great. Yeah, thanks so much. I just want to start by saying I really appreciate the opportunity to come over and take some of your time today, in this speaker series and kick off the fall for you. So it's a pleasure to meet you, and I'm hoping that you'll find this interesting and maybe learn something. And then second, we can have Q&A and discussion and that kind of thing, and I can learn from you, and I think we'll, of course, find a lot of areas of overlapping interests and common goals and that kind of thing. So what I was planning to do this afternoon is accomplish three objectives. The first is I wanted to tell you a little bit about this place, Boys Town, where I work. And then secondly, I'll describe my research agenda just briefly and illustrate it with two recent research projects that focus on risk and protection, prevention in the world of adolescent substance use research, and then try to conclude with some general thoughts about future directions that may be promising for the field to go toward, and there in particular it might be fun to talk about other ideas that people have. So let's get started. Let's see if I can advance this. And I did want to mention that this is quite a survey of concepts, so a lot will be coming at you, and I hope wherever you're coming from, you'll find at least something that is intriguing. If you like numbers, there's some numbers. If you like big concepts, there's some big concepts, and everything in between. So it's a rather eclectic talking about. I still can't see the difference too. Okay, got it. I know computers. So what about this place, Boys Town? Maybe you've heard of it. Has anybody heard of Boys Town? I mean, at least you're Nebraskans, so that helps. Over there in Omaha. Well, Boys Town is a large national nonprofit service provision organization. Celebrated its 100th year anniversary a couple of years ago, so it's been around for a long time, over 100 years. And despite the name, Boys Town, that's more of a legacy name. It serves boys and girls and has for many decades now. And it has this very broad mission, as you can see, of changing the way America cares for children and families. And an equally broad vision of an America where every child and family receives the effective, compassionate care they need to be healthy in body, mind, and spirit. So clearly it's a very grand and ambitious mission, as it should be, to help those in greatest need. And it's headquartered in Omaha, Nebraska. And several of you, I know some of you have been out to the campus out in West Omaha. and it's a very pretty campus. It's about a square mile now, and it can be quite an impressive place to visit. I recommend the next time you're in the Omaha area to stop by. One of the things you'll see when you visit the campus and you can drive through is these large homes. It looks like kind of a slice of Main Street America, except there are these huge homes, and those are the residential treatment homes for Boys Town. Each one holds 6 to 8, either all girls or all boys, and the teaching model is around a family teaching couple, highly trained, but who manages their home like a family does. And the skill teaching and the psychoeducation and so on occurs in the day-to-day interactions within the family and in the home, and there are schools on campus and so on. This is the legacy program for Boys Town, long-term residential care. However, it's very clear that you're not going to achieve a mission like this with residential care alone, right? You need a lot more than that. And indeed, Boys Town over the years has evolved and grown tremendously to the point where there really is a full array of services provided by the organization now. And those services fall across the 2 divisions of the organization. One division is youth care. That's the youth and family programming. The other division is health care. So some of you may know there's also a National Research Hospital in Omaha that is part of Boys Town. And so across those 2 divisions, we have everything ranging from intensive residential treatment, family-style residential treatment that I described on one end of the spectrum, all the way down to universal prevention, parent training, teacher training for classroom management, for example, and then everything in between, intensive in-home family treatment and so on. The hospital over the years has had a focus on audiology, speech and language difficulties, and deafness, and so there's a full range of services wrapped around that area as well. So it's quite a diversity. But not only do you need an array of services to achieve an ambitious mission like that, you also need reach. It can't just be in Omaha, right? And up until the 80s, it was just in Omaha, and it was just residential care. But starting in the 80s, the national expansion was initiated. And as you can see now, and it kind of ebbs and flows, the sites open and close, and so this is a current snapshot of where we stand. And right now we have 9 sites in 7 states across the country. And you can see some of the states like Florida have multiple sites. There's 3 sites in Florida, DC, New England, and Vegas, and other places. I like to call attention to the fact that the first ever site outside of Nebraska for Boys Town was Tallahassee, Florida. And I don't think that's a coincidence at all. I think that was a board decision in like February. Like we should expand. We really should, Where could we go? Florida. And now there's 3 in Florida. So there's something going on there. I think we can see. Interesting kind of statistic in terms of the trend of service delivery in Boys Town. As the expansion occurred, there was also this movement away from residential care. So a little over 10 years ago, even at that period of time, 90% of the children served by Boys Town were served in out-of-home programming. Right now, that has been reduced to less than 5%. And so, basically 95% or so of kids and their families are served in their communities, in their homes, in their schools. That's a sea change for an organization like Boys Town, which is, in my opinion as a prevention scientist, a positive direction, of course. You can see up at the very top, I'm in the youth care side of the organization, and annually, in terms of direct service to children in youth care, it's about 30,000 kids a year. A differentiator for Boys Town compared to many other similar service providers is that all of their programming has a foundation in translational research. In fact, this is another fascinating story in Boys Town's history. We don't have time to go into in detail, but back in the 70s, the intervention model being used at the time was not healthy. It was not a positive environment at the time. And the powers that be had the insight that we need to make this grounded in research, theory-driven, and overhaul this model. And they did. They went to the University of Kansas, they found a teaching family model, they brought it up to Boys Town and adapted it. And really, ever since the 70s, there has been a strong commitment to research for their programming and a common theoretical model in this service array, which I think is quite impressive. So over the decades then, there has been this research focus, and it's occurred in different iterations over the years. In fact, very early on, it went away for a period of time. It wasn't very mission-focused, and the people who held the purse strings at Boys Town said, all this money is going out to research, but we're not seeing any benefit from that, and they shut it down. I consider it a small miracle that they decided that wasn't a failed experiment, and they said, let's return to a commitment for research, but do it in a very mission-driven way. So the current iteration, the Child and Family Translational Research Center, dates back to 2018 for the name. That's the time that I stepped into the role, and I changed the name. And I wanted to, the term translational research has been around for a long time. Maybe it's a little bit of a tired term. It's not, it's not fresh and an exciting term anymore, but it is a meaningful term. And my thinking, as well as others, is if a research shop embedded within a service organization is about anything at all, it ought to be translational research. And so we just wanted to make that very salient, even at the level of the name. That being said, the name change is grounded in a previous research institute that dates back to the late 80s. And so we have about 15, when we're fully staffed, we're a little low right now, we have about 15 staff members total, from research assistants on up to PhD level research scientists and everything in between. We have very strong university partnerships, as has already been mentioned. For example, with the University of Nebraska-Lincoln right here, Tim and Jen, very close colleagues. Also, we have a formal partnership with the Academy for Child and Family Wellbeing here on campus, Kristen DuPont-Hurley and Alex Trout, if anybody knows the two of them, as well as others. And then other universities, University of Washington, Iowa State University, and so on. And that's an essential part of our productivity and our strength. And we also have an advisory board that we bring in every now and then. And in this research center, I'm not going to say much more than I already have, so if you have questions, you can ask them later. But we are involved in a full range of translational research activities, everything from measure development and theory development to program development and evaluation, of course, more basic developmental research, in the big intervention deployment box, which is the dissemination and implementation world. A little bit of everything. And the most important point here is that to the extent possible, we work very hard to have these translational research activities grounded in partnerships with providers and with children and families who are served in these programs. In other words, we really like to have these research activities start and end with those who are closest to the practice. So and it doesn't happen naturally. The interesting thing is when I went to Boys Town, I thought, here's a research shop that's surrounded by service provision. And all these partnerships and all this translational research stuff will happen almost automatically and organically, and it absolutely doesn't. There's like some kind of natural barrier between researchers and the rest of the world. We're literally right in the middle of campus, and we have to work so hard to get next to, side by side, in front of practitioners, administrators, children and families for that matter, and hear their research questions, their needs, their opportunities, and translate them into research questions, and then feed that information that we get from studies back into practice. That's what we're all about, and that's our highest ideal. Not that everything looks exactly like that, but that's our goal. Okay, so this is getting more into the main part of the presentation, which is just telling you a little bit about my research agenda and illustrating it with a couple of projects. And I like to say my research falls into two buckets. One is a term you could use is developmental etiology. These are longitudinal studies of child development, family process, peer relationships, school functioning, and so on. And it's still applied, even though it doesn't involve program evaluation. Its ultimate goal is to generate knowledge that informs the development of interventions. So these are the kind of studies that help us identify malleable intervention targets, risk and protective factors for outcomes like substance use in adolescence. And not only what the target should be, but when we should intervene. Because when we do longitudinal studies, we can find when risk and protective factors are most strongly related to the outcomes. And that's maybe a clue as to when we should intervene on those factors and sustain that intervention over time. The second bucket is program development, evaluation, scale up, and so on. So we take that information, we translate it into program development, and then this area involves the design and conduct of evaluation studies, including randomized controlled trials, but also other designs to answer questions about efficacy, effectiveness, scale up. I also like to say I'm not in the slightest bit a health economist, but I've had opportunity to dabble in some of the benefit costs and cost effectiveness analysis work. This is a fascinating area. That is the full extent of my knowledge in it, what I just said, so no questions there, right? Okay. Now, those two buckets over the years have been guided by this very broad biopsychosocial developmental contextual model. And that is a mouthful to say. That's much longer than the title. And there's a lot going on here. No need to talk about it in any kind of detail. I basically just like to show this because it's a model that orients us to a few principles. One of those principles is there are multiple correlated risk and protective factors that fall in multiple domains of socialization: family, school, peer, community, individual, and they're related to multiple correlated outcomes, because outcomes such as substance use don't occur in isolation. They tend to co-occur with conduct problems, mental health problems, and other issues. So a recognition of all that. There's also a recognition in this model of moderating influences that could either buffer risk, that's the resilience idea, help kids thrive even though they're experiencing risky conditions, or that maybe exacerbate risk in a synergistic way and make things even worse. Relationships are bidirectional, but rarely move from one direction to another. They're developmentally sequenced, so the issues and relationships and so on in one developmental period, early childhood, are very different than those in early adolescence. And they're situated in a broader developmental, historical, political, social context and so on. So a lot there, and the way I like to conclude with this slide is it clearly suggests many potential avenues for research questions, but I think one of the more interesting directions that people are taking this kind of model these days is in better understanding the specificity of relationships here. What risk factors, for example, are related to which outcomes, for whom, and under what conditions? And then we can use that information to inform interventions to increase their relevance to targeted populations and hopefully their impact, right? turning to one of the research projects I wanted to show you in thinking about that model, there are a lot of different approaches to dealing with the phenomenon of multiple correlated risk factors in an individual's life. And of course, the most common one is to address a risk factor on its own, right? So we might be interested in something like child maltreatment, and we do studies on child maltreatment. Sometimes, and I mean many times, we study these risk factors individually, but together in adjusted analyses. So we might take child maltreatment and put poverty in the mix and study those together. On rarer occasions, we might test the interactions of those variables together and so on. That's one whole, obviously, common strategy. But another strategy is to examine the accumulation of risks within an individual. And this is an approach that comes from a tradition called cumulative risk, or a more recent tradition, adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. I'm sure everybody has heard of that. And it's a relatively simple idea based in this hypothesis that if you can just address the accumulation of risk factors in an individual, the hypothesis is as the number of risk factors increases, the likelihood of problems increases. Now, what is inherent in that hypothesis is we're not paying attention to what the individual risk factors are. It's just the burden, the collective burden of the risk factors. And there's no attention to the severity and so on. And so you can see that the typical way to operationalize a cumulative risk or an ACEs index is to take risk factors. Some of them are nationally dichotomous, some of them need to be dichotomized to represent presence versus absence. So you either have it or you don't, and then you sum it into a count index, and obviously the higher number, the higher risk factors you have. And then again, the expectation. And it's been borne out in considerable research dating back to the 70s that yes, the higher number of risk factors is related to worse outcomes. But there's a lot of areas of growth for this literature. One of them is it tends to be a critique for being fairly atheoretical. And it is kind of a kitchen sink approach. I mean, we create these indices and we just throw whatever we have in there, and you'll see that's exactly what we did. But we are getting, the field, I think, is getting much better, moving in areas of nuance in terms of theory, particularly related to the burden that risk factors have on physiological and psychological resources for coping with stress and so on. So that's a pretty promising area of development. So that's background to set up this study. We drew on that literature to conduct a secondary analysis, the study that we call, in short, Pathways. And this is a collaboration with a good colleague of mine, Yuka Savalainen, who was at the University of Michigan and now he's at Wayne State University. And it draws on an incredibly rich resource called the 1986 Northern Finland Birth Cohort Study. This is one of those large-scale birth cohorts that can only be conducted in Europe, in particular, social welfare country, because everything is interlinked and they follow people. And in fact, it has followed over 9,000 kids through 3 developmental periods with very rich data collection, parent, teacher, and by the time they were children, child surveys, as well as hospital records covering prenatal birth period, also childhood at ages 7, 8, and then middle adolescence at ages 15 and 16. The study also extends to some degree into young adulthood, but only with population register data. So no survey data at that point in time, although it is being collected now. But the population register data are complete for this sample, and it includes things like hospital records as well, criminal records, tax records, school records, you name it, it's in there, and it's quite impressive. Given the location of the study, it is the northern, more rural part of the country of Finland. It is 100% white European. A lot of the literature in this area has been conducted in the United States or the United Kingdom, to some degree, smaller degree, Australia. So it fills the gap in that sense in a unique context that, again, is a social democratic welfare system that obviously is not without the kind of problems that this cumulative risk work is designed to address. This is a very busy slide. There's only a couple points to make on here. No need to go into the details, because this just gives a snapshot of the study design and the participation rates. And the main points here are what an amazing effort they have conducted over the years to go from the prenatal birth period on so many kids, follow them over this time with extensive data collection, amazing participation rates, again, including that complete population registered data. This is another even busier slide, and this is a snapshot of the selected measures that are available in the data, mainly related to our project. That's what we obviously paid attention to. And, you know, this study is very characteristic of the cohort types of longitudinal studies, and that is, it has incredibly broad measurement. The breadth of it is incredible. But the depth on any particular construct or behavior is not particularly deep, you know, given the burden on data collectors and all the participants and that kind of thing. So conducting a secondary analysis on a project like this is often a search for available items, you know, for the constructs you need. This is an illustration of one of the analyses we conducted, and the overall aim of the project was to link all of the data on this construct of cumulative risk from the prenatal birth period to the onset and progression of substance misuse in adolescence, as well as diagnoses on into adulthood. And so for this particular analysis, we had a few objectives. One was to examine the relationship between cumulative contextual risk at the prenatal birth period all the way out to the initiation of alcohol and separately cigarette use by the time these kids are adolescents. And that's a very long time period. A lot of research hasn't focused on that, but some of those relationships have been established. We wanted to go further by also addressing the question of the potential mediating mechanisms, and we focused on peer interactions. So it could be that having more of these risk factors in a child's life is related to being more likely to be marginalized by friends in childhood when that becomes a very important developmental task, to perpetuate aggression or be the victim of aggression. So those were two of our mediators. And then, of course, those kinds of risks also may increase the likelihood of problem behaviors in the kids themselves. And those mediators, in turn, we know from literature, can be related to substance use. But then the third question, we also wanted to know, what would those potentially causal developmental processes look like if we considered temperament characteristics that tend to be more stable and biologically based to some degree, specifically fearfulness, inhibition, and hyperactivity, distractibility. I won't show all the measures, we don't have time, but this is a snapshot of our primary predictor, the cumulative risk index, which draws predominantly from the family domain. And again, we had to use what was available, but we found 10 indicators that are common for these risk indices. Things like being born to a teenage mother or single parent, exposure to substance use, either in the womb from mom or at birth, very early, you know, from dad and the environment. And then, of course, very standard measures of socioeconomic disadvantage and that kind of thing. So these were dichotomous or dichotomized, summed into this classic cumulative risk index. And we addressed the three questions I showed you with the discrete time survival mediation model. And so as that name suggests, this is a model that combines traditional survival analysis with traditional path analysis or structure equation modeling mediation analysis. In this case, to examine cumulative risk to substance initiation, potentially through the peer and problem behavior mediators, and then in a second step, considering the role or adjusting for these temperament characteristics. So, considering the survival part of the model, which is depicted here, this is a plot of the hazard rates by age. It shows you basically the likelihood of initiating and how that increases as kids age. And you can see that it does increase to around age 15, the onset of alcohol and cigarettes, and then starts to level off a little bit thereafter. Both of those curves are pretty similar, and so, and in fact, they're a little bit accelerated in the Finnish context compared to the US context, for example, in part because both alcohol and tobacco cigarette smoking are much more normative in the Finnish context than here, and so kids tend to initiate a little earlier there. Turning to the mediation model, I'll just illustrate it for alcohol, but the patterns were pretty much the same. And the outcome variable was a retrospective measure of substance use onset given when kids were age 16. In our first pass, we found some initial support for the idea that there would be mediation through these peer and problem behavior pathways. That is, cumulative risk was related to higher level of behavior problems and higher level of peer aggression. Both of those were related in turn to earlier initiation of alcohol and cigarettes. Cumulative risk also was related to a higher level of peer marginalization. That in turn was related to delayed age of onset for alcohol and also cigarettes. And at first blush, that may seem a little counterintuitive. It doesn't seem to be functioning as a risk factor, as we might expect. The way we explain that, I think there's some plausibility to this, is, of course, substance use among adolescents tends to be a social activity. And it could be that being marginalized from the peers excluded kids from the social networks that would expose them to alcohol availability and socialization into use and so on. Maybe, but maybe only up to about middle adolescence, because we also know that marginalized kids tend to group together and do naughty things together, delinquency and substance use and other things. So I'd be curious to see if that would extend further out into adolescence. But what happens when we throw temperament into the model, the two temperament characteristics, not showing all the coefficients, I just wanted to show the adjustments. And we lose the developmental pathways here, in particular because the predictive relationships of cumulative risk to the three mediators go away. And so maybe what we see here is that rather than being a causal developmental process, it's more of a non-causal phenomenon that's grounded at least to some degree in that more basic temperament that is related to peer problems as well as substance use and that kind of thing later. Interestingly, both peer variables were still related to initiation. Any substance use prevention program is going to have address peer influences, and of course we still see that's important. That's just a snapshot. I just wanted to show the kinds of questions that we had addressed in this study. We also tackled other questions, generality versus specificity of prediction to multiple outcomes, not just substance use, but risky sex and conduct problems, linear versus nonlinear associations and length profiles, and so on. Gilbert Parra, maybe people know Gilbert, he's also a UNL faculty member. It's a big reason we were productive on this project, so we're probably there as well. But so what? So I walked you through this pretty developmental, basic kind of study, but set it up by saying it's applied research, and it is, because again, we want to use this kind of information to design interventions. This is one example of a way to think about it, and that is from these kinds of studies, we learn what are the potential risk factors that we can target to try to reduce the influence of, and frankly, the presence of those risk factors in an individual's life, and what are the protective factors. And let's develop interventions that infuse those protective factors into children's lives and increase the number, or increase the protection. What are the moderators, especially the buffering moderators, that even if a child might be born into a risky condition like what I just illustrated, to no fault of their own, and there's nothing they can do about it. But that doesn't mean they're doomed to this trajectory of problems down the road. Of course, we can build things into their environment that increase their resilience to the risky conditions they experience, and do so in a developmental timed and intervention sustained way. So what we do here is going to be very different than what we do here because of the developmental considerations, but keep it going throughout childhood to address substance misuse and other outcomes. And of course, as a field, in many fields, and I'll speak for prevention science, we have been successful over the past 2 and even 3 decades in taking this kind of developmental etiology information, developing interventions, testing them, and showing that they work. So in fact, we have a fairly large pool. Let's talk specifically about adolescent substance use prevention. We have a fairly large pool of tested, effective programs in that domain, as well as many other domains. And that's a very good thing. But now I'm going to transition to a different part of our presentation and address one of the big problems we're facing right now, which is, yes, we have a pool of such programs, but they're not out there in the world being used in routine practice on any kind of scale that gets the impact we would like to see. And what I had just described there, of course, is the classic science to practice gap, or the so-called valley of gap. There is a big disconnect between what we know from research, even in terms of programming, research-driven programming, and what happens in practice. And therefore, people are not benefiting as much as they could on a large enough scale from the work that we have done in intervention development and evaluation. Now, that is a very complicated problem. Multi-determined, lots of issues going on there, so I don't want to trivialize it, but I am going to focus on one reason why we have had this science to practice gap, and that is our reliance, maybe over-reliance, on the traditional program evaluation, development, and evaluation cycle. So people have probably seen this, maybe even in different forms, but basically, in whatever form you see it, it depicts a fairly linear process that goes from the kind of developmental studies we've just been talking about, epidemiology and etiology, into program development, and then from program development into efficacy studies. These are typically randomized controlled trials that address the question, can a program work under ideal conditions with everything you can throw at it to set it up for success? Will it do what we designed it to do? That's where the question typically starts. If a program is shown to be efficacious, then we move to effectiveness studies, the next box. Effectiveness addresses the question, now that we know it can work, will it work when the conditions aren't so ideal? In other words, when it's out there in the messy real world. So maybe in the efficacy study, PhD students administer the intervention. That's not going to work on a large scale out there. And so less highly trained interventionists in the effectiveness study, just as one example. And then you can see if this program is shown to be effective, it goes into this very large box labeled Type 2 Translational Research or Dissemination and Implementation Science. And I won't describe those in any detail, but it depicts a series of steps that deal with the questions about scaling up a program that now we know works on a large enough level that we get population impact, that we really move the needle on something like the prevalence of marijuana use among adolescents across the country. This has been a very useful cycle. And so, I'll start by saying that we had a lot of advancements based on this cycle. However, it has been critiqued and there are some problems associated with it. One of them, and you may have heard this statistic or something like it, and that is people like to say it takes an average of 17 years for 14% of the programs to go from down here, efficacy, all the way up to scale and impact. Now, you can quibble with those specific numbers. It doesn't matter what they really are. The point is, it takes a long time and not very many programs get out there in the world to help people. Most programs help people during the randomized trials that they're being tested in, and that's it. And one of the reasons for this that the field speculates about is that, unfortunately, in this very linear model, dissemination, or getting it out in the real world, is an afterthought. I mean, if you look at this figure, you can see it, that it, we go, now I'm pushing the 18 minutes. We go through all of this work, and people build productive careers and become famous doing all this stuff, and then transition into that box only later. And so there's some thinking that that's too late. That's too late. And in fact, the discipline of implementation science is promoting the idea that, you know what, if we want to get things out there in the real world at scale, we ought to be thinking about dissemination from the very earliest stages of research and program development, so that we're designing them to be successful in the real world. I like that idea a lot. I think it's useful. And there's probably a lot of strategies for doing that, but one of them is unique and I think has been a little overlooked. And it's captured in this interesting quote that I have really enjoyed over the years. And it says, instead of taking an efficacious program and attempting to find a delivery route for the program, an alternative design is to find a program with a dissemination vehicle, test it, and if needed, enhance the program's efficacy. In other words, why don't we start with programs that are already out there in community settings? Now, again, speaking for prevention science, but I know it's true in other disciplines, we have tended to go into communities with the assumption that the programs that are already there don't work, right? And if that's your assumption, what's the task at hand? It's to get rid of those programs and put new ones in there. Your program, the one that you developed by going through that cycle and showing that it works. But of course, your program didn't come out of their context, their issues. It doesn't have their champions and so on. It turns out it's extremely difficult to get a community to give up their programs and just blindly take another one that comes from somewhere else. So, a small tweak to that is, why don't we go into communities assuming that at least some of the programs that are already there probably do work. And if we do, then the task at hand changes. The task becomes, how do we find out the most promising programs that likely do work, test them, and if we can show they work, we've closed the science to practice gap, but in a different way, kind of coming from the opposite. It's more practice to science, right? So that is an intriguing strategy. It's been used a little bit, but not a lot. And I can tell you that in the field of adolescent substance use prevention, when it has been used, it hasn't been very successful. The best example that everybody's thinking about right now is DARE. It's repeatedly has not been shown to have much efficacy. Even some adaptations haven't fared very well. And so we suggested that maybe the reason it hasn't been used much and hasn't been terribly successful is that it hasn't had an organizing framework. So we set out to fill that gap and develop a framework. This is it. I won't go through it in any kind of detail, but at a basic level, what this is designed to do is help people identify programs that are being used in community settings and select those that seem to be very promising programs that likely work. I'll come back to that point in a second. But if we can take those programs and evaluate them, hopefully in their standard form that they're already being used in. I mean, that's the point. They're already out there. But sometimes we might know from the literature or from other programs that have been tested and shown to work that some modifications are needed. Ideally, if it's modified, it would be modest. Because, of course, what would be the point of going into community and changing the program so much that it doesn't look like the program anymore. Evaluate it, and then the premise here is that if we can show that a promising program works, we not only help close that gap right away, but we also may be able to expand the dissemination from where it's at already. And how might that work? Well, one of the obvious ways is through access to new funding mechanisms for service delivery. We are in the evidence-based program movement right now, right? And so a lot of funders of service delivery require providers to have evidence that their programs work. And that's a wise investment, of resources in something that works. Or they require the program to be listed on evidence-based program registries like the California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse. And so if there's a program that's out in the community that hasn't been tested, it doesn't have access to those resources for dissemination. If we can show the program works, all of a sudden this new world of funding becomes available and off to the races, right? And of course, since this involves working with a community-based program, the whole process has to be grounded in strong university-community researcher partnerships. Okay, I hope I'm doing okay on time. What time are you? Yeah. Excellent. This is the framework that we used. I'm transitioning into an illustration of the second study, and that is to evaluate a Boys Town parent training program called Common Sense Parent. It's a terrible name. I didn't name it, but that's what it is. It's just a parent training program. That's all it is. And it's a very standard program if you know this world. It's for parents of children between the ages of 6 and 16, which is way too wide of a developmental window. I'll come back to that point. But it's administered in a group workshop setting. It's 6 two-hour sessions, so it's relatively brief and very standard. And here's the reason that we considered it promising. And these are features that you can look for in other programs that are in community settings. One is its development was guided by theory. This program is grounded in the teaching family model. Again, like all programs at Boys Town. That draws on social learning theory, coercion theory, and applied behavioral analysis principles. Standard stuff, but important stuff nonetheless. Secondly, it has components in it that we know are in other parent training programs that have been tested and shown to work. And so that increases the likelihood that this program would work because it's in other things, the active ingredients that seem to be in other programs that work. Things like positive parenting, praise, consistent, moderate discipline, guidelines, and monitoring. It's manualized, has certification and training protocols, available in multiple languages and so on. And it also has some positive preliminary evidence. A lot of service providers like Boys Town, and Boys Town obviously is probably a much better resource than a lot of service providers, but nonetheless, in this information age, a lot of service providers collect basic clinical data on their program delivery. So they might get pre-post on families that went through the program, and that obviously has caveats, but can be useful and for basic analyses and understanding of potential effects. In the case of Common Sense Parenting, the positive preliminary evidence has been consistent with the logic model. That's what's depicted here. And that is that the 6 sessions of the program have components that are designed to influence 2 proximal targets. One is to increase those basic parenting skills that parents need in their lives with children. And again, that's things like praise and other positive parenting strategies, appropriate discipline, the avoidance of harsh discipline, and monitoring and that kind of thing. And then a second proximal target, though, is to teach parents how to model and teach their own children self-control and emotion regulation. So this is staying calm when you're frustrated, problem solving, not being impulsive, but pausing and going through a deliberative process and so on. And then those 2 proximal targets in turn are expected to reduce problem behaviors in the kids, things that we care about, conduct problems, substance misuse, and so on. As a consequence of all of that stuff, being promising and everything, common sense parenting is fairly widely used out there. At Boys Town, it serves about 6,000 children a year directly. We also have a trainer or trainers model. So other organizations or a community has a trainer come in and teach people how to be workshop leaders, and then they go on and use it. So that occurs across the country and beyond. However, until recently, until this trial, common sense parenting had never been evaluated in a rigorous randomized trial. And that's what we set to do with NIDA funding. This is a collaboration with colleagues of mine at the University of Washington. And in fact, the data collection site is Tacoma, Washington. We implemented common sense parenting as a selective prevention program, and that is targeted toward kids and families at higher risk. In this case, they were families of 8th grade students attending very poor performing middle schools in Tacoma, Washington. Schools that fed into high schools with very high dropout rates. We randomly assigned a target parent and a target adolescent to the standard common sense parenting program condition. That's the program as used in the world, and basically a minimal contact control condition, no intervention control condition. We also had a third experimental condition, actually, and it was a modified version of common sense parenting. I'm not going to talk about that today because, again, the idea here is to keep the focus on how is it actually being used now, and does that work? 4 waves of assessment: pre-test, post-test, which was 6 months after baseline, and then we had a 1-year and 2-year follow-up after intervention. The overall goal here was to implement common sense parenting at this key developmental transition, and that is the transition to high school. That's a time where the kid is on a positive trajectory. Sometimes it can get derailed, or if it is positive, we want to keep it that way. And other things can emerge in adolescence during high school, like substance use and other problems. We also wanted to test it in a narrow developmental range. And maybe, to be honest, at the higher end of when you think standard parent training might work for parents who have kids as old as, 14 and so on. Our hypotheses were consistent with the logic model I showed you. I won't review that. We collected parent surveys, youth surveys in the home with computer-assisted interviewing, and we also got school records. So that was our assessment packet. Overall, 226 families across the 2 conditions, 321 if you consider the third condition that I'm not talking about. Relatively diverse and low-income families. That was by design, given the selective prevention approach and the region that we were in. We achieved 95% retention at our 2-year follow-up, so we worked very hard to keep families and kids in the study, and it worked. We videotaped the workshops in action and had them independently coded for fidelity to the manual, and found that 95% of those core components were implemented as designed, so that was good. And we had just shy of 60% of families assigned to CSP attend half or more, at least half of the sessions. Now that's engagement issue, right? And with especially with group workshop-based programming, this is the perpetual challenge. How do we get parents to show up and stay with the program? We did a little bit better than what you find in the literature on this study, but clearly room for improvement. It wasn't perfect. So we conducted an intent-to-treat structure equation modeling analysis that addressed the first part of that logic model, the one that focuses on the 2 proximal influences. And this is what we found. CSP was not related to improvements in parenting. And that was not only true in this model, but at other time points, operationalizing parenting in other ways. So needless to say, at a fairly early stage in the project, this was a little disappointing. It's a parent training program. This is the basic parenting concept. But of course, we speculated parenting, these kinds of things, praise and other things are probably pretty crystallized in the parent by the time they have a teenager, right? Even if they have younger kids, they've been parenting already for 13, 14 years. It's going to take more than 2, or 6 2-hour sessions probably to make an impact on that. We did find some evidence on this second part of the model, that is teaching parents how to model and teach their kids emotion regulation, self-control. And we found evidence of some improvements from pre-test to post-test. That's at the end of middle school, right before the transition in the kids. So in the second analysis to address the second part of the logic model, we can carry forward that emotion regulation finding, not the parenting one, and ask the question, do those improvements relate to outcomes in high school? And what we found were statistically significant indirect effects of common sense parenting on reduced substance use, conduct problems, and especially school suspensions in terms of a more robust finding in high school through those improvements in emotion regulation. So we consider that to be some good news. That being said, very transparently, we had relatively modest findings in support of common sense parenting from this study. Some important ones consistent with the logic model, but not wildly robust. And really, as we conducted this, we realized it turned out to be a very challenging trial. This idea of testing a program that's already in use, because you have unique issues related to balancing internal versus external validity, right? And so we wanted the control and so on, but we wanted to have the program be implemented as it is implemented in practice. And so we had Boys Town trainers go to Tacoma, Washington and train workshop leaders who we hired there, but we hired them exactly the way they're hired here, in the same kind of background and requirements and so on. And so, we definitely learned a lot of lessons about fidelity assessment, about participation in the program, and also addressed a number of additional outcomes. We have been taking those lessons learned and extending them into, for example, here, a second trial using this framework, and it's another Boys Town program called Well-Managed Schools. This is that teacher training classroom management program. It also is very widely used by Boys Town, has been for years, has some positive preliminary evidence, but until now has not been subjected to a randomized trial. So this is in the data collection, really recruitment and data collection phase. It's being conducted with good colleagues at Iowa State University, including Cleve Redmond. Some in the room might know Cleve Redmond. He's a good friend of UNL and has been for a long time. I'm going to go through these light and fast because I feel like I've been talking a lot, and we probably want to, hear from you and be sensitive to the time. But just some broad thoughts in these two buckets about directions for future research for the world of developmental mediology. And I think here there's some promise in drawing from the principles we're seeing in the world of precision medicine. Some are taking that and applying it to something they're calling precision prevention, But here, really, the idea, like we suggested earlier, is how can we be much more precise in targeting our prevention efforts to specific individuals with specific interventions at specific time points for specific outcomes, And the only way we're going to be able to develop those kind of interventions is with a much more nuanced developmental etiological literature that understands biomarkers and neuropsychological processes, subgroup differences, the influence of broader conditions. For example, a very salient one now is the influence of marijuana legalization as a legal context for many states and so on. And I do want to be sure to highlight here one such study that is being conducted now with a very accomplished researcher at UNL, Tim Nelson, and Jen and others. And so I won't go into that detail, but we're able to examine the role of executive control and its development in the onset and progression of substance use of kids. And that's been a lot of fun and productive. What about prevention? Well, for prevention, we're still grappling with this question, how do we get it out there in the world? And a few things that are opportunities there. I think we can be much more creative, and many are, about our evaluation research methods. We have had an over-reliance on the randomized controlled trial and a hierarchy of evidence for a long time. It's important we get information from it, but if we're really going to have impact out there, we probably need to rethink some of our evaluation methods, maybe big data analytics and things like that, understanding health equity, and of course, and then the perpetual prevention question, which is how do we routinize it? How do we sustain it? And one of the ways that the field is working on is integrating prevention into public systems of care, primary care, for example, pediatric clinics and so on. Another example there I won't go into, but I want to end with this slide, because I know I've thrown a lot at you, a lot of different concepts, and done it pretty fast. But I always like to end with this slide, because I don't want you to get lost in the details, in the trees, and this helps pull us back. Why do we do all this? The etiological studies, the program development, evaluation, so on. The end game here is population health, and that is science-based solutions to social, behavioral, physical health problems, scaling up programs that we know work, large enough reach that we can achieve population impact and reduce health disparities. So that's what we hope, obviously, all of us, right, to achieve. So that is that.
Thank you so much. So we do have some time for questions. I know some people might kind of pop out during this period of question and answer, so I wanted to let you know, introduce myself. I'm Devin Crawford. I am the Center Administrator for the Rural Drug Addiction Research Center, which is actually RDAR, even though people say RDAR and lots of other things, so you can correct them on the acronym. We have another funny one too, which is Synergy, but it is always pronounced SNRG, so those can go wrong. You can find us on 4th floor, Goldfeather Hall. If you search for the Rural Drug Addiction Research Center, you can also find us and reach out to me if you have any questions. I invite you to come visit us, or if you're interested in learning more about what we do or want to collaborate, we certainly would love to talk with you. So I do want to leave some time for questions though, so Alex can answer any questions. So yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm wondering, what have you seen any type of prevention, success, or things in early signs of oppositional defiance disorder?
Yeah, oppositional defiant. Well, as a targeted outcome, not so much, to be honest, because of course it tends to get packaged with conduct problems and disruptive behavior. And I think our effects are stronger, much stronger on the prevention of conduct problems per se than opposition. I can't think of a prevention program targeted specifically to oppositional, at least that maybe has an evidence base behind it. Yeah, that's a gap that somebody should fill. Yeah, good question. Yeah.
I was wondering about Boys Town itself. Do they need this, I mean, probably this is outside of your scope since you focus on youth and adolescents, but does Boys Town do any longitudinal studies with people who graduate from school there and the long-term positive impact of that?
Excellent question about whether or not Boys Town does follow-up studies with kids who go through programming, especially the residential, right? And the answer is absolutely yes. In fact, really, you know when I mentioned that the research effort got off to the wrong start because it wasn't mission focused and then it went away, and then it came back. And the way it came back was with the follow-up study. That was what reignited a research focus at Boys Town. So back in the 90s and into the 2000s, 2 longitudinal follow-up studies of kids leaving the residential care homes were conducted, one with 5-year follow-up and one with 16-year follow-up. And both of those were designed to say, how are they doing now that they're out there in the world? And that is the #1 question for out-of-home care. I mean, you can take a kid and put them in any kind of controlled setting. I mean, everybody in the organization goes through 2 weeks of pre-service training. I did. To get trained in the model, the teaching family model, to learn how to, deliver skills training and that kind of thing. And so kids are walking to school and they get skills training from somebody. And so, the football coach is, teaching them problem solving and that kind of thing. Well, it doesn't work that way out there in the real world, right? And so we need to know how are they doing. And I will tell you transparently that both of those studies have shown many areas where they're functioning quite well, and then some areas where they're still struggling. I mean, it's a very high-risk population by the time they've been removed from their home. They tend to do very well in staying out of residential care, and that's a big deal. They tend to do pretty well at staying out of legal trouble. They don't do very well at staying away from substance use and some other things like that. In addition to those two, those were dedicated follow-up studies. In addition to that, I would say for maybe the past 12 to 14 years, there have been routine follow-up data collection efforts that we conduct for all kids leaving all the residential care programs, and then several of the community-based programs, like one called In-Home Family Services, and they get follow-ups at 6 and 12 months. So routinely, and this is routine clinical data, there is follow-up up to a year after they depart from the program just to chart their outcomes. And not only that, but to continue to offer connection to resources and so on if they need them. But from our standpoint, meaning the research standpoint, it's to see what are their outcomes looking like. Yeah.
You said you dabbled in cost effectiveness and cost benefit.
Yeah.
Can you speak about the trial and some of the positive benefits that you saw, how that might translate to potential cost savings? Of course, the most important outcomes are the changes in trajectories for these kids' lives. But in terms of making the argument for public health dollars and investment, how do these kinds of effects translate to saving money down the road? Yeah,
great question, and a real issue for prevention especially, because of course the investment in prevention is before the problems are there. Everybody wants to throw money at a problem that's in your face, but so now we didn't do any kind of cost analysis on that common sense parenting trial. Probably we should, but maybe a missed opportunity there. But we worked with health economist at UNMC. His name is Fernando Wilson. He's now at the University of Utah, actually. And he actually helped us create an Excel spreadsheet tool that is a benefit cost calculator, and it's pretty slick. And so we've been able to use that in the family home program. That's that family-style residential, as well as the in-home family one that I just mentioned. And what we're able to show is that, when you can impact outcomes, I mean, the school suspension outcome would be a good one, but those monetizable outcomes, like staying in school and staying out of legal trouble and so on, I mean, we have huge literature, of course, that shows if a kid drops out from school, if a kid gets into the juvenile justice system, it costs society a boatload of money, to incarcerate kids and to deal with the problems they generate by not being in school and not having a productive job and that kind of thing. So usually, what we end up doing is showing that, well, we've been able to see that this program helps, let's say reduce school suspensions. That's tied to dropout. And therefore, we expect this many fewer kids to drop out if they get common sense parenting. And dropout costs this much money, And so if we prevented dropout on this scale, we would save, and it's always millions and billions of dollars, when it's over the life course. So there's a lot of assumptions in that gets built into that too. So that is a roundabout answer to your question, but yeah. But really, what the mechanism is, if we can show that we impact these big ticket monetizable outcomes that people care about, then we can do this kind of cost analysis and show if you invest just a little bit here, oh my golly, you're going to save.
And even relatively modest effects.
Modest. That's very true, yeah. Modest program effects that can translate into really huge savings down the road. Yeah. I hope we grow that area of work, actually. Yeah.
Have you seen anything, or have colleagues talked about with technology, have you seen an increase in dissemination of these programs, or do you feel like we're basically exactly where we were before we have all this technology available? Because I know in a lot of our work, I feel like it's very underutilized. And sometimes I feel like we're attempting to utilize, we were just talking about this.
Yeah.
We feel like we're utilizing it really well, but
Right.
the community, we are
That's right.
disconnected.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's how I think I would answer that question. There are a lot of technology-driven interventions that have been developed, and you sit on a study section like at the National Institutes of Health. If there are intervention studies, they almost always have a technology piece built into them, and web-based and that kind of thing. And that's all very positive, but I think we've still gone down that same pipeline or cycle, you know. And I mean, the technology should make it more accessible because we live in a technology-driven and connected world now. But if the only dissemination consideration is, you know, this is web-based and everybody has access to the web, we still haven't really solved the problem of how do we get it out there and get people using it on a large scale so it helps them, you know. So I mean, I would be inclined to say more along the lines of the experience you described, where we probably think we are developing those and maybe hoping that's closing that gap, but on the community members side of the equation, I'm not sure we've still gotten to where they're seeing it and feeling it, you know? Yeah. But clearly, obviously, a lot of promise in that, you know. I guess the point is, it's a really interesting thing to think about, but it's, you know, technology is a tool that can facilitate better translation and scale up, but even still, it's not going to accomplish that objective if, going back to that cycle, we haven't thought about who are the consumers, what are their needs, you know, how naturally are they going to integrate this into their lives and use it, and, you know, all those kind of consumer questions. And yeah.
I mean, I'm 100% with you. Gamification on the phone is not going to make kids eat vegetables.
Yeah.
So like,
Yeah.
The word gamification.
Gamification.
Is triage is a repulsive in my mind. Slightly related, but somewhat different topic. So in the case where you're sort of trying to pull out what kind of interventions being used in communities, you have a fairly formal one that you're already in Boys Town involved with. How do you deal with this sort of more, I'm thinking because we work in the, you know, other end of substance abuse rather than tobacco and alcohol, where, you know, we're dealing with syringe exchange or intervention programs that are super messy and really difficult populations. How do you go about sort of extracting out from that what you want to see if it's working, right? Where it isn't quite so. I love to think there's a manual. You know,
I love it.
Is there a version of what you're talking about that works on the messier side? I'm just interested in your brainstorming about that.
No, I love that question. In fact, I presented this about 3 weeks ago. Several times, but most recently about 3 weeks ago, I got a question I'd never gotten before, which is similar to yours, but that even goes to the next level. Because they were like, well, what about, you know, community? Basically, they were saying, not with this language, a community that's so disorganized, so impoverished, you know, that stable housing and jobs and, you know, that stuff isn't even there. And I was just like, that's a game changer there. I mean, because then you're going in with, okay, how do you stabilize the housing and how do you raise up the workforce and that kind of thing, well before this kind of social behavioral programming, I guess. So that's even a different matter. The short answer is, I don't know if I haven't gone down that road and thinking about adapting that. I don't know if anybody has, but there clearly could be real promise. I mean, you could take in the paper, of course, we have a section that walks through the criteria, you know, like the manual and that kind of thing. But you could envision adapting that and loosening those up and obviously tailoring them, you know, to specific areas, let alone specific areas of research, but areas of communities and that kind of thing. And so maybe it doesn't need to be completely manualized, you know, but Yeah, it's a great question,
Curious about it.
yeah.
I mean, my own opinion is that how do you extract what is the intervention?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
I think that's a good comparative implementation or translation question.
Oh, I couldn't
Science question, and I think
Yeah,
if you
it
did
is.
that, then you might be on to something that captures some of that informalness, or ask questions about those kinds of mechanisms that we may not
Yeah.
have our hands on very quickly. Anyway, I'm just
I
curious.
agree, I like that.
Some graduate students should take
There you go,
this,
there you go,
as a
yeah.
dissertation,
Yeah, that's right.
and grab this opportunity.
Yeah, that would be good.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, and of course, then that sort of leads into the core components or essential ingredients
Right.
conversation, which, I call them kitchen sink trials. I use the term kitchen sink, I guess, because we develop these programs, we don't know exactly what should be in them, so we put a little bit of everything in there, and then we test them globally. And to answer the question, does it work as a package? And so, when we get to the point where we know much more what those core components that really work are, then when you go into a messy community and, oh, I see that, and I see that, that could help. Good, very good. Yeah.
Do you want some questions? Well, thank you guys so
Yeah,
much.
thank you.
Thank you so much.